You don't just lose your way in the warp, you lose time, you lose reality. The Cathedral of Iron was supposed to reach Cadia in 3 weeks. Instead, the crew watched each other age and vanish, while the ship's corridors bent into shapes that shouldn't exist. By the time they clawed back into real space, 900 years had passed, and some of them were still inside. I am going to tell you what it means to be lost. Not lost in the way a child loses their way in a crowd or a soldier finds themselves separated from their squad in the smoke of battle. I mean lost in the way that unravels the fabric of what you are, where the very concept of direction becomes a joke told by something that has forgotten how to laugh. I am Navigator Adept Reliant Voss, and I served aboard the Cathedral of Iron for what my chronometer insists was 6 months, but what my bones remember as lifetimes. I am recording this account not because I believe anyone will hear it, but because the act of forming words into coherent thought is the last thing that reminds me I was once human. The Cathedral of Iron was a dictator-class cruiser, 3 kilometers of consecrated steel and prayers etched into every rivet. She carried 12,000 souls, not counting the servitors, and her mission was mundane by the standards of the Imperium. We were to transport reinforcements and material to the Cadian Gate, a milk run through established warp routes that I had navigated 2 dozen times before. I had been with the cathedral for 8 years. I knew her machine spirit's moods, the way her hull sang in the Imperium, the particular flavor of unreality that clung to her corridors when we translated. Captain Tovin Helix was a man of rigid faith and military precision, the kind of officer who treated the Lectitio Divinitatis like a tactical manual. His crew feared him appropriately, which is to say they loved him in the way one loves a father, who has never shown weakness. We entered the war on schedule. Jella field stable, plasma drives humming their machine hymns. I settled into my navigation blister, a sphere of crystalline armor that jutted from the ship's spine like a blind eye, and opened my third eye to the currents of the Imperium. What I saw was familiar. The cathedral rode the warp like a blade cutting through turbulent water, her shields a bubble of reality, forcing back the unreality that pressed from all sides. The Emperor's light, as manifested through our Jella field, kept the nightmares at bay, or so we believed. The first sign that something had gone wrong came 3 days into our journey, though I would later learn that our chronometers disagreed wildly on how long we had actually been traveling. I was charting our course. Corrections when I felt it. A shift in the current, subtle as a change in air. Pressure before a storm. The warp around us was moving differently, not flowing past our reality bubble, but curling around it, tasting it. I have navigated the Imperium for 30 years. I know the difference between normal turbulence and attention. I reported the anomaly to Captain Helix immediately. He arrived at my blister within minutes, his uniform pressed to parade perfection despite the hour, his face carved from stone. I explained what I had felt, choosing my words carefully. Navigators do not speak lightly of such things, and captains do not appreciate uncertainty. Can you correct our course? He asked. I can try, I said, but the warp is not responding as it should. It is as if the currents themselves are rearranging to match our movements. He stared at me with eyes that had seen void warfare and Xenos horror and never blinked. Then we proceed with faith. The Emperor protects. I wanted to tell him that faith was a shield, not a map, but I held my tongue. Instead, I turned back to my charts and began the delicate work of adjusting our trajectory. The cathedral responded to my guidance, her reality drive straining as we angled away from what I perceived as the disturbance. For 6 hours I thought I had succeeded. The sensation of being watched faded. The warp currents began to feel normal again. Then we hit the divergence. There is no adequate language for what happens when a ship Traveling through the Imperium loses its navigational lock. In real space, you can be adrift, but still measure your position relative to stars, planets, the galactic plane. In the warp, there is no up or down, no fixed point, no constants. You are moving through a dimension where thought and emotion have weight, where the laws of physics are polite suggestions at best. When a ship loses its way in that howling madness, it does not simply go off course. It goes off the map entirely, into regions where the warp has never been charted, because no one who entered them has ever returned to tell the tale. I felt the divergence like a hook in my third eye, yanking us sideways through a dimension that should not have a sideways. The cathedral shuddered, not physically, but conceptually, as if the ship itself was uncertain of its own existence for a moment. Alarms began screaming throughout the vessel. The Jella field flickered just for an instant, but long enough for those with sensitive souls to feel the breath of something vast and hungry pressing against the hull. Captain Helix ordered battle stations, which was the correct response to any crisis, but entirely inadequate for this one. You cannot shoot your way out of being lost. I worked frantically at my charts, trying to find any landmark, any current eye recognized. But the warp around us had become a featureless expanse of screaming color and malicious geometry. It was as if we had sailed off the edge of every map simultaneously and found ourselves in a void beneath the void. Navigator Voss, report. The captain's voice came through the Vox, tight with controlled panic. We have diverged from all known routes, I said, and my voice sounded hollow, even to myself. I cannot find our position. The warp here does not match any recorded topology. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his words were carefully measured. Can you navigate us back? I do not know where back is, Captain. I do not even know where here is. I heard him breathing over the Vox, a sound like wind through a crypt. Then he said, "Then we will hold course and trust in the Emperor's guidance. Continue monitoring. Report any changes immediately." What else could he say? What else could any of us do? The hours that followed taught me the true meaning of dread. Not fear, which is a response to immediate danger, but dread, which is the slow understanding that you are in a situation with no good outcomes. I remained at my station. I opened to the Imperium, watching the nothing around us. The cathedral drifted through the warp like a ghost ship, her engines still firing, but with nowhere to aim. The crew went about their duties with increasing tension. Servitors continued their tasks with mechanical indifference, unaware that anything was wrong. The human crew knew better. By the 10th day, or what our clocks insisted was the 10th day, the first temporal anomalies began to manifest. A tech priest reported that he had performed 6 hours of maintenance on a plasma conduit, only to return to his station and discover his chronometer had advanced by 3 minutes. A deck officer watched a servitor walk the length of a corridor in what appeared to be frozen time, each step taking subjectively hours from his perspective, while the servitor's internal clock registered normal passage. 2 arms men got into a fist fight over a gambling debt, and by the time their sergeant arrived to break it up, both men insisted the fight had lasted either seconds or hours, and they could not agree on who had thrown the first punch. I felt it in my navigation blister as well. I would chart a course correction, blink, and discover I had been staring at the same set of calculations for what my body insisted was days, though my chronometer showed minutes had passed. Other times I would begin a notation and finish it before my hand had moved, as if my thoughts were outpacing time itself. The warp was not just around us anymore. It was bleeding into us, rewriting the rules of causality within our reality bubble. Captain Helix called an assembly of senior officers in the strategium. I attended via Holith, unwilling to leave my station for even a moment. The other officers looked haggard, their uniforms disheveled, their eyes carrying the particular hollowness that comes from too many hours without real sleep. The captain himself looked as pressed and perfect as ever, but I could see the tremor in his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. "We have been in the warp for 10 days," he began, and I saw several officers glance at each other with expressions that suggested their personal experience disagreed with that time frame. Navigator Voss has been SIL. Forces unable to find a route back to real space. Our jello field remains stable, praise the Emperor. But we are experiencing what the Adeptus Mechanicus calls temporal displacement. This is a known phenomenon in uncharted warp regions, and while unsettling, it is not immediately lethal. He paused, and I knew he was choosing his next words carefully. "We will continue to hold faith and maintain discipline. The Emperor watches over his servants, and we will not falter in our duty. All personnel are to report any unusual experiences to their immediate superiors. Tech priests are to monitor the jello field and ship systems with increased vigilance. Navigator Voss will continue to search for a route home." It was a good speech, calm and confident, exactly what the crew needed to hear. It was also a lie of a mission. What the captain did not say was that we had no idea how to escape our situation, that the temporal anomalies were likely to worsen, and that the longer we remained in this uncharted region, the more the warp would seep into the ship's reality. After the assembly, the captain contacted me privately. "Tell me the truth, Navigator. What is our situation?" I looked at him through the holoth projection. This man who had commanded through void battles and boarding actions with perfect composure. And I told him what I believed. We are adrift in a region of the warp that should not exist, or perhaps exists only because we are observing it. The warp is not passive here. It is responding to us, possibly even shaping itself around our presence. The temporal distortions will worsen. Eventually, the crew will begin to experience more severe displacement. Days passing in minutes, years passing in hours, or the reverse. Subjective time will diverge so severely that communication becomes impossible. A man will age to death in what feels to him like decades, while his chronometer shows a day has passed, or he will experience a single second stretched across what his mind perceives as an eternity. The captain's face remained stone, but I saw his hands clench. "And the jello field it is holding," I said. "But the field is designed to maintain real space physics within its boundary. If time itself becomes unstable, I do not know if it can compensate. We may find ourselves protected from demonic incursion, but still vulnerable to chronological dissolution. Speak plainly, Navigator. We may die of old age in minutes, Captain, or we may be trapped in an eternal moment, conscious, but unable to move or think in any way that matters. Or we may simply cease to exist in any meaningful sense. Our molecules scattered across temporal dimensions we cannot perceive." He nodded, slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. "Then we pray, and we work. Find me a way home, Navigator Voss." That is an order. I wanted to tell him that some situations were beyond orders, beyond duty, beyond even faith. But I simply nodded and returned my attention to the warp. The days continued, or perhaps they did not continue at all, but simply repeated in variations, like a piece of music played on an instrument that has forgotten its tuning. I charted the nothing around us and found patterns that made no sense. Currents that flowed backward, eddies of calm in the screaming void. Once I thought I saw something massive moving in the distance, a shape so large it took minutes for my perception to register it as a shape at all. But when I focused my third eye upon it, there was only the usual chaos. The crew began to fracture, not in terms of discipline, which Captain Helix maintained with iron will, but in terms of shared reality. Groups of workers would report completing the same task, but describe it happening in different ways, in different orders, sometimes with different people present. a meal served. In the galley would be remembered by some as breakfast, and by others as dinner, and checking the chronometer would confirm both memories as correct from their subjective frames. Entire shifts would pass in what felt like moments or stretch into subjective eternities. I heard stories from across the ship filtering up through the chain of command. An engine seer who worked for what he experienced as 3 months, without stopping, maintaining the plasma drives through a haze of exhaustion that should have killed him, only to discover, upon finishing, that 5 hours had passed and his body showed no signs of the ordeal. A squad of armsmen who stood guard at a bulkhead door and experienced nothing for what their chronometers insisted was 6 hours, but who all shared the same hallucination of standing watch for decades, growing old at their posts, watching each other's hair gray and skin wrinkle, and finally seeing their companions die of age while they remained unable to move or call for help, trapped in bodies that aged in their minds but not in reality. A young rating came to the ship's chapel and told the priest she had lived an entire life in the space between 2 heartbeats. Married, had children, grew old, died, and woke up still standing in the corridor where she had been walking. The priest gave her the emperor's blessing and assigned her to lighter duties. But I saw the look in her eyes. She was not entirely present anymore. Part of her was still living that other life, that shadow existence. The captain continued to maintain order through force of will and faith. He conducted daily prayers over the ship's Vox network, his voice steady and certain, reciting the litanies of protection and endurance. The crew responded as best they could, though I noticed their voices lacked conviction. You can only pray for deliverance for so long before the words begin to ring hollow. I worked without rest, or perhaps I rested constantly and only thought I was working. Time had become so subjective that I could no longer trust my own experience. I charted and recharted the warp around us, looking for any weakness, any thinning of the barrier between immaterium and materium that might indicate proximity to real space. I found nothing, or rather, I found everything and nothing simultaneously. A quantum state of navigational data that refused to resolve into useful information. On the 23rd day, by the ship's official chronometer, though I personally experienced it as the 47th day, and my assistant reported it as the 9th, the Jella field began to flicker with regularity. The fluctuations were brief, microseconds at most, but they were increasing in frequency. Each time the field wavered, the ship's reality wavered with it. Colors would shift into spectrums that human eyes were never meant to perceive. Sounds would become tactile. The smell of incense from the chapel would arrive. Before it was lit, servitors would freeze mid-motion, their mechanical brains unable to process the contradictory sensory input and have to be manually reset by tech priests who were themselves struggling to maintain coherent thought. I reported this to Captain Helix with appropriate gravity. The Jella field is not failing in a technical sense. I explained the generators are functioning within parameters, but a field is designed to create a bubble of real space normally within the warp here where time and space are already compromised. The field cannot establish what qualifies as normal. It is trying to maintain consistency in an environment that has no consistent state to maintain. What does that mean for us? He asked. It means the boundary between us and the warp is becoming theoretical rather than absolute. We are still protected from direct incursion, but the line between inside and outside is blurring. The ship itself may begin to experience dimensional instability. As if to punctuate my words, the deck beneath my feet rippled like water, not violently, but unmistakably. The metal flowed in a wave from bow to stern, solid matter, behaving like liquid for a moment before resolving back into steel. My stomach lurched not from motion sickness, but from the existential wrongness of experiencing matter. Forget what it was. Supposed to be. Throne, preserve us, the captain whispered. And it was the first time I had heard anything like fear in his voice. The dimensional instabilities began small but grew rapidly. Corridors would extend or contract, not smoothly, but in jerks and stutters, as if space itself was having difficulty maintaining consistent dimensions. A passageway that should have been 20 m long would stretch to 100, then snap back to 10, then settle at its original length, all while crew members were trying to walk through it. Several ratings suffered severe disorientation and had to be sedated. One unfortunate armsman was caught in a corridor when it contracted and was compressed into a space that should not have been able to contain a human body. He survived, screaming, his bones broken in patterns that suggested he had been folded through dimensions orthogonal to the standard 3. The medic staff did what they could, but there was no treatment for spatial compression trauma in their manuals. The ship's geometry began to lie. Doors would open onto rooms that could not possibly fit within the space allocated to them. A storage locker might contain an expanse larger than the entire deck. The mapping servers became useless. Their programming unable to reconcile the contradictory data of corridors that connected in ways that violated basic topology. Crew members reported walking in circles and arriving at their destination or traveling a straight line and ending up behind where they started. I remained in my navigation blister, afraid to leave it because I feared I would be unable to find my way back. My space was small, cramped, lined with the instruments of my trade and the protective wards that kept my mutant third eye from drawing unwanted attention from the warp. Here, at least, reality remained somewhat stable. Here, I could still think in straight lines, but even here, I was not entirely safe. I began to see things in the corners of my vision, not demons or warp entities, but fragments of the ship itself, echoes and repetitions. I would look at my instruments and see them from angles that should not exist, as if I was observing the same space from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Once I saw myself sitting at my station from behind, working at calculations, and when I turned to look, there was nothing there but the wall of my blister. The image persisted in my memory with perfect clarity, but the reality denied it had ever existed. The crew's mental state deteriorated along with the physical stability of the ship. The daily prayer services became chaotic. Affairs with different sections of the crew hearing different words from the captain's Vox-transmitted sermon, or hearing the words in different orders, or hearing the same phrase repeated into infinity. Some crew members stopped attending because they reported experiencing the entire service in a single instant, all the words arriving simultaneously and overwhelming their ability to process meaning. Others claimed the services lasted for days, the captain's voice droning on and on until they thought they would go mad. From the repetition, fights broke out over increasingly bizarre disagreements. Two tech priests came to blows over whether a particular ritual had been performed, with each absolutely certain they were correct, and the other was lying or insane. The truth, I suspected, was that both were correct from their subjective experience, but the ship's fractured timeline meant both had experienced different versions of the same event. There was no objective truth anymore, only competing narratives of personal experience. Captain Helix attempted to maintain order through increasingly strict discipline. He instituted curfews, though the concept of time-based restrictions was nearly meaningless when time itself was unreliable. He increased patrols, though the armsmen often got lost in the shifting corridors and had to be guided back by servitors who at least had consistent internal maps, even if those maps no longer matched reality. He held public punishments for infractions of discipline, floggings, and confinements, which I thought was a mistake because it spread fear rather than unity. But I understood his reasoning. He needed the crew to believe in something absolute and unchanging. And if the laws of physics would not cooperate, then the laws of the Imperial Navy would have to. suffice. I worked in my blister. I constantly opened to the warp, searching for anything that might offer escape. And slowly, gradually, I began to notice something peculiar. The warp around us was not random. The chaos had patterns. Subtle and complex, but patterns nonetheless. It was as if the Imperium was arranging itself in response to our presence, not just reacting, but anticipating. The currents of unreality flowed in ways that seemed almost intentional, creating eddies and vortices that corresponded to the cathedral's movements before we made them. I started to test this hypothesis, requesting minor course corrections from the helmsman and watching how the warp responded. Every time we change direction, the surrounding space would shift to accommodate us or sometimes to hurt us, guiding us into channels that I had not chosen. It was subtle enough that I had not noticed it before, but once I started looking for it, the evidence was undeniable. The warp was not just around us, it was learning us. I reported this to Captain Helix, and for the first time I saw his facade crack. "What does that mean?" he demanded. "Is there an intelligence directing this?" "A demon." "I do not believe so," I said slowly, trying to articulate a suspicion that existed more in intuition than reason. If this were a demon, we would see different signs: possession, corruption, direct psychic assault. The warp is not static. It is the realm of thought and emotion given form. Our presence here, our fear and confusion and desperate hope, all of that is bleeding into the surrounding space. The Imperium is absorbing those emotions and shaping itself in response. We are not being hunted. We are being reflected. Then how do we escape our own reflection? He asked, and I had no answer. The truth became clearer over the following days or weeks or hours. The Cathedral of Iron was no longer simply adrift in the warp. She was becoming part of it. The ship's machine, spirits, those fragmentary echoes of intelligence that inhabited every Imperial vessel, were changing. The tech priests reported increasing anomalies in the ship systems. Machine spirits that responded to commands before they were given. Autosystems that activated in anticipation of needs not yet articulated. The plasma drives began to hum prayers that were not in there. Programming, litanies and languages that the Mechanicus records did not recognize. I heard one of these prayers, myself, transmitted through the Vox network by accident or design. It was not Gothic or Lingua Technis or any of the sacred machine languages. It was something older or newer or outside the concept of temporal progression entirely. The words seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly into my mind, and they carried meaning without language. They spoke of hunger and patience and the pleasure of consumption spread across eternities. They spoke of waiting and becoming and the joy of being many in one. They promised peace through dissolution. I severed the Vox connection and reported the incident immediately. Captain Helix ordered the tech priest to purge the machine spirits and perform extensive rites of cleansing. The rituals were carried out with desperate fervor, incense, and sacred oils and chanted prayers filling the ship's vital systems. But I could tell from the plans, tech priests' faces, that the cleansings were not entirely successful. The machine spirits had been touched by something they could not simply scrub away. The ship herself was changing in more obvious ways as well. The corridors that had been shifting and unstable began to settle into new configurations that made no architectural sense. Passageways would curve through spaces that should have been occupied by other rooms. Support struts angled through bulkheads without apparent connection. The crew learned to navigate by memory and landmark rather than by map, creating mental paths through a geography that defied documentation. Stranger still were the new spaces that began to appear. Rooms that no one had ordered built that appeared in areas where sensors showed only void or structural supports. A ratings crew sent to investigate one such space found a chamber the size of a cathedral, its walls lined with statues of weeping angels whose faces shifted between human and something else when observed indirectly. The chamber should not have been able to fit within the ship's hull, and yet it was undeniably there, solid and real and wrong. The captain ordered. It sealed, and it was, but more such spaces appeared throughout the vessel. I began to understand what was happening. The Cathedral of Iron was being rebuilt by the warp, reshaped into a configuration that reflected our collective unconscious as much as our physical structure. Every fear, every hope, every desperate prayer was being absorbed by the Imperium and then written back onto the ship's substance. We were not just experiencing the warp. We were becoming a part of it, transformed into a vessel that existed in both real space and the Imperium. Simultaneously, the implications were terrifying. If the ship continued to change, would she still be a ship in any meaningful sense? Would the crew remain human, or would we too be transformed into creatures of thought and nightmare? How long before the boundaries between self and other dissolved completely, and we all merged into some collective mass of consciousness that remembered being individual but could no longer maintain the fiction? I tried to explain this to Captain Helix, but he refused to accept it. We are servants of the Emperor, he said, his voice carrying the rigid certainty of absolute faith. We are protected by his will and the strength of our souls. The warp cannot claim us, so long as we remain faithful. Faith is not armor against this, I said, perhaps too bluntly. The warp does not care about our beliefs. It is beyond morality, beyond judgment. It simply is. And we are in it, and it is changing us whether we consent or not. His hand moved to his sidearm, and for a moment I thought he might shoot me for heresy. Instead, he said very quietly, "Then we will maintain our humanity through discipline and duty. We will not surrender to despair, and we will continue to search for a way home. Is that clear, navigator?" "Yes, Captain," I said, because what else could I say? But I knew with the certainty that came from decades of reading the warp's moods that faith and discipline would not be enough. We were drowning in unreality, and all our struggling only pulled us deeper. The psychological toll became unbearable for some of the crew. 3 ratings committed suicide in a single day, though each death was strange. 1 stepped into a corridor and simply stopped existing. His body found days later in a section of the ship he could not possibly have reached in the time between his disappearance and discovery. Another hanged himself in his quarters. But when his body was cut down, it crumbled to dust as if he had been dead for centuries rather than hours. The third walked into the primary plasma reactor and was instantly vaporized. But several crew members reported seeing her walking through the ship's corridors for weeks afterward, her ghost or echo or some fragment of her consciousness, unable to accept death. The suicides affected morale more than any of the spatial anomalies or temporal distortions. Death at least was supposed to be final. It was supposed to make sense. To see it twisted and perverted like everything else aboard the cathedral drove home the message that we had entered a realm where even death offered no certain escape. Captain Helix ordered increased surveillance and mandated daily psychological evaluations for all crew. But the ship's Medicate staff were themselves struggling to maintain coherence. How could you evaluate someone's sanity when reality itself was insane? What baseline of normal could you possibly apply? I watched from my navigation blister as the Cathedral of Iron descended into a kind of functional madness. The crew continued to perform their duties because duty was the only anchor left, the only thing that felt real in a ship that had become a fever dream. They cleaned corridors that rearranged themselves overnight. They maintained systems that operated according to principles of physics that changed based on who was observing them. They stood watch at posts that moved when they were not looking. And they did all of this with a grim determination that was either the highest expression of human will or the deepest delusion. I admired them in a distant way. I was isolated in my blister, alone with my instruments, and my constantly open third eye, watching the warp coil around us like a serpent that has already swallowed its prey and is slowly digesting it. The crew at least had each other. They could share their madness, compare their experiences, confirm that they were not entirely alone in their perception. I had only myself, and increasingly I was not certain that myself was a unified concept anymore. The worst part of navigating the warp under normal circumstances is the constant vigilance required. You cannot let your guard down for even a moment because the Imperium is always seeking weakness, always probing for a way in. But here in this uncharted abyss, the warp did not need to seek weakness. It was already inside, woven into the fabric of our ship, whispering from our own machine spirits, reflecting our fears back at us in physical form. I had to maintain my focus, not to navigate us home, but simply to maintain my own identity against the slow dissolution of everything that defined me as separate from the chaos around us. On the 48th day, according to my personal chronometer, which I no longer entirely trusted, I saw the thing we had become. I was charting the warp as I did every hour. I opened to the Imperium when I perceived a vessel moving through the chaos near us. It took me a moment to focus on it, the image wavering and uncertain. But as I concentrated, I saw it clearly. A ship 3 kilometers long, dictator class, every detail precise and perfect. The Cathedral of Iron. But we were the Cathedral of Iron. I stared at this impossible reflection, this twin that should not exist, and slowly understanding crept into my mind like ice water into my veins. The warp had not just absorbed our fear and reshaped our ship. It had created a duplicate, a mirror, a predatory echo, born from our collective consciousness. And as I watched, I saw this phantom cathedral change course, angling toward us with obvious intention. I called Captain Helix immediately. We have a situation. There is another ship approaching. It appears to be the Cathedral of Iron. The silence on the Vox lasted several seconds. Then, explain. I tried to find words that would not sound like the ravings of a madman. The warp has generated a construct based on our vessel. It is mimicking us down to the hull markings and armor patterns. I believe it is what I have been sensing. The predatory intelligence, I suspected it is not separate from us. It is us, or rather a version of us, that the warp has shaped from our own psychic presence. Is it hostile? I do not know, but it is approaching with clear purpose. Captain, I recommend we alter course immediately. To where? He asked, and the hopelessness in that question spoke volumes. Where was there to go when we were lost in an infinite sea of madness? Anywhere but here, I said. The captain gave the order, and the cathedral shifted course, her reality drive straining as the helmsman guided us away from the approaching duplicate. But the phantom ship matched our movements perfectly, anticipating every change in direction. It was learning from us because it was us, born from the same fears and desperation that we carried. We could not outmaneuver our own reflection. I watched it close the distance, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to resignation. We had been fighting the warp, struggling against unreality with the tools of reason and faith and discipline. But you cannot fight your own shadow. You cannot navigate away from something that exists only as an expression of your existence. The phantom cathedral pulled alongside us, near enough that I could see details of its hull. It was perfect, a mirror image, in every way. But there was something wrong about it that I could not articulate. The proportions were correct, but the essence was alien, like a perfect painting that somehow fails to capture the life of its subject. It was A ship shaped by minds that had never truly understood what a ship was, only copied the form without the function. Then it opened fire. The impact was not physical. There was no damage to our hull, no breach of atmosphere, no casualties from weapons fire. Instead, the Phantom Cathedral attacked us with unreality itself. Where its lance batteries would have been, it projected beams of condensed warp energy that passed through our gel-off field without resistance and struck the ship's interior spaces directly. Corridors that were hit by these attacks simply ceased to follow consistent rules. Gravity would reverse or multiply. Time would fragment into parallel streams. The crew caught in these zones experienced instant divergence, their timelines splitting into countless possibilities, all occurring simultaneously. I witnessed one of these attacks strike near the engineering decks. Through the ship's internal sensors, I watched as an entire section of the vessel experienced every possible outcome of its existence at once. The crew there lived and died and never existed, all in the same moment. Some aged to dust instantaneously. Others found themselves as children, their minds intact, but their bodies regressed. One tech priest simply unfolded into a higher dimensional shape, his three-dimensional form revealed as a cross-section of something vaster and more terrible. The cathedral shuddered under this assault, not from physical damage, but from existential uncertainty. The machine spirits screamed in binary and sacred language, their prayers becoming pleas for identity, for some confirmation that they were still what they had been. The lights flickered between spectrums, settling on colors that hurt to perceive. The air tasted of copper and rust and something sweet like decay. Captain Helix ordered return fire, and the gunnery crews complied. But our weapons were designed for real space combat. Our macro cannons launched shells that simply vanished into the warp between our hull and the Phantoms. Our lance batteries carved lines of superheated energy that the duplicate absorbed without effect. We might as well have been shooting at a mirror with bullets made of light. The Phantom Cathedral continued its assault, methodically targeting different sections of our ship. Each strike created zones of unreality that spread like infections, corrupting the consistency of space and time around them. The crew began to fragment, not just temporary, but narratively, each person experiencing their own version of events with decreasing overlap. Communication became nearly impossible when no two people could agree on what was actually happening. I remained in my navigation blister, somehow protected by the concentration of my will and the wards that had always guarded my third eye. From here, I could see both ships simultaneously, the real and the reflection. And I began to understand something crucial. The Phantom was not separate from us. It was not an enemy in the traditional sense. It was more like a tumor, a growth spawned from our own psychic presence in the warp. And like a tumor, it was killing us not through hostile action, but through uncontrolled replication of what we were. An idea formed in my mind, terrible and desperate. If the Phantom was born from our collective consciousness, then perhaps it could be affected by that same consciousness. If I could reach into the warp, not as a navigator seeking safe passage, but as a psychic force actively shaping reality, I might be able to influence the Phantom, change it, dissolve it. The cost would be extreme, opening myself to the warp without the protection of distance and discipline would leave me vulnerable to every horror the Imperium contained. Worse, to affect something as large and complex as a ship-shaped construct of condensed psychic energy would require me to pour my entire consciousness into the effort. I would have to become the bridge between the real cathedral and the Phantom, my mind, the battlefield where they would merge or destroy each other. I would not survive it. Even if I succeeded, the psychic feedback would burn out my mind like a candle exposed to a furnace. But if I did nothing, the cathedral would be torn apart by unreality, and the crew would be scattered across temporal streams like debris from an explosion, each consciousness isolated in its own subjective hell. I contacted Captain Helix on a private channel. I believe I can stop the Phantom Cathedral, but the process will kill me, and I cannot guarantee success. Explain your plan, he said, his voice tied. I told him. I described how I would need to drop all psychic defenses and reach into the warp with my full consciousness exposed. How I would attempt to merge my awareness with the Phantom ship and then unmake it from the inside, collapsing its structure by denying it the coherent identity it needed to exist. How the psychic shock would almost certainly destroy my mind, leaving my body alive but empty. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he said, "Are you certain this will work?" "No," I said, honestly. "But I am certain that doing nothing will result in our total destruction. This at least offers a chance." Another pause. "Then you have my authorization, Navigator Voss." "The Emperor protects." "The Emperor protects," I repeated automatically, though I felt no comfort in the words. I began my preparations immediately. I dismissed my assistant, a young woman who had served me faithfully throughout this nightmare, and sealed my navigation blister from the inside. I spoke a final prayer to the Emperor, not because I believed he would save me, but because the ritual of prayer was comforting, and I wanted to face my death with some measure of dignity. Then, I opened my third eye fully, dropping every psychic defense I had spent decades building, and reached into the warp with my naked consciousness. The pain was immediate and total. It was not physical pain, though my body responded, as if it was every nerve firing in sympathetic agony. It was the pain of exposure, of a mind designed for limited perception, suddenly forced to process the infinite. I felt the warp pour into me, a flood of sensation and emotion and thought that had no owner, just pure experience, without context or meaning. I felt the hatred of things that had never lived but remembered dying. I felt the love of entities whose affection was corrosive. I felt the laughter of madness, and the weeping of stones, and the hunger of the void itself. Through this chaos, I pushed my awareness toward the Phantom Cathedral. I felt it like a cancer in my perception, a wrongness that called to me because it was made from me, from all of us, from every fear and hope we had projected into the warp. It had our shape, but none of our purpose. It was a ship without crew, without mission, without anything but the mimicry of existence. I reached into its core, my consciousness flowing through psychic space like poison or medicine, and began to work. I attacked its foundations, the conceptual pillars that allowed it to maintain coherent form. I denied its existence. I rejected its reality. I poured my entire identity into the act of unmaking, using the force of my will to insist that this thing had never been, could never be, was nothing but a bad dream that would fade with waking. The Phantom Cathedral resisted. It had been born from collective consciousness, and it defended itself with that same force. I felt it push back against my intrusion, a psychic pressure that threatened to crush my awareness into nothing. We grappled in a space beyond space. Two concepts of reality, struggling for dominance. I felt myself fragmenting under the strain. My identity breaking into pieces as I tried to maintain coherent thought against the dissolution of everything I was. But I had one advantage. I was willing to die. The Phantom, born from our fear of death, clung to existence with desperate intensity. It wanted to be real more than anything, and that desire was its weakness. I exploited it ruthlessly, offering it false hope and then snatching it away, creating doubt and uncertainty in its structural integrity. Gradually, incrementally, I felt it begin to collapse. The Phantom Cathedral started to lose cohesion, its perfect mimicry degrading into approximation, and then into formless chaos. The attacks on our ship ceased as the construct lost the ability to project organized force. The mirror image in the warp began to fade, dissolving back into the raw stuff of unreality from which it had been shaped. I would have felt triumph if I still had the capacity for emotion. But by that point, I had poured so much of myself into the battle that there was little left to feel anything with. I was barely a consciousness anymore, just a function, a process, a denial given temporary agency. I watched the phantom die with the same detachment I might have observed a mathematical equation resolving. Then the feedback hit me. When the phantom cathedral collapsed, all the psychic energy that had gone into its creation had to go somewhere. It rushed back along the connection I had forged, a tsunami of unstructured warp force that struck my exposed consciousness with the force of a supernova. I felt my mind shatter like glass, thoughts fragmenting into millions of pieces that could never be reassembled into anything resembling Relian Vos. My last coherent thought was a small prayer that the cathedral would survive, that my sacrifice would mean something. Then there was only pain. And then not even that, just a vast emptiness where identity used to be. I do not remember what happened next. According to the ship's logs, which I have since reviewed, my body remained alive in the navigation blister for another 7 hours, breathing and bleeding from eyes and nose and ears, but showing no signs of consciousness. The phantom cathedral disappeared from all sensors and psychic detection, leaving only the real vessel adrift in the warp. Captain Helix ordered emergency rites of mental restoration, but the ship psychiers were unanimous that my consciousness was gone, beyond recovery, scattered across the Imperium like ashes in a storm. What I do remember is the slow, agonizing process of gathering myself. It was not like waking from sleep. It was like being dead and then gradually particle by particle remembering what it was to exist. I had no body at first, just awareness, fragments of memory floating in darkness. I did not know who I was, or why I existed. I was simply perception, without perceiver, thought without thinker. Gradually, over a span of time that felt like years, but might have been minutes or seconds, I began to coalesce. Memories returned, disconnected at first, like puzzle pieces scattered across a table. I remembered my name. I remembered the ship. I remembered what I had done, though the memory felt distant, as if it had happened to someone else. When I finally opened my physical eyes, I was no longer in my navigation blister. I was in the ship's medic ward, restrained to a bed with monitoring equipment attached to every part of my body. A Medicare officer noticed my consciousness returning and immediately began checking my vitals, speaking words I could not quite pause into meaning. Later, much later, when I could speak again, I learned what had happened. The destruction of the phantom cathedral had created a massive disruption in the local warp currents, like dropping a stone into still water. That disruption had revealed something that my sacrifice had inadvertently uncovered, a thin place in the boundary between materium and immaterium, a weakness in the warp that indicated proximity to real space. Captain Helix had recognized the opportunity immediately. While I lay catatonic in my blister, he had ordered the ship to make for that weakness, gambling everything on one desperate push toward reality. The cathedral of iron, battered and transformed by our time in the warp, had broken through into real space like a drowning man, breaking the surface of the ocean. We had escaped, but escape is a relative term. When I was finally well enough to review our situation, I learned the cost of our time in the warp. We had emerged in real space, yes, but not where or when we had intended. Our chronometers and astrogation data told a story that was difficult to accept. We had been in the warp for 6 months by the ship's official records. But when we emerged, we found ourselves 940 years after our departure date and 3,000 light years from our intended destination. The Cadian Gate, where we had been bound, had fallen centuries ago. The galaxy we emerged into was changed beyond recognition, reshaped by wars and catastrophes we had never witnessed. Of the 12,000 souls who had entered the warp aboard the Cathedral of Iron, fewer than 3,000 emerged with their minds intact. The rest had been killed by the temporal anomalies, driven mad by the spatial distortions, or simply lost in the fragmenting of reality that had afflicted the ship. Their bodies were found scattered throughout the vessel in various states of preservation, some appearing freshly dead, others aged to mummification, still others in states that defied medical explanation. The ship herself bore the scars of her voyage. Entire sections remained dimensionally unstable, rooms and corridors that still flickered between configurations, spaces that were larger on the inside than their external dimensions allowed. The tech priests declared large portions of the cathedral off limits permanently, sealing them behind blessed bulkheads and warning sigils. The machine spirits had been changed by their exposure to the warp, and while they still served, they served in ways that were not entirely predictable or entirely safe. Captain Helix survived, though he was not the same man who had ordered us into the warp 1,000 years previous. He had aged decades in the months of subjective time, his hair gone white, his face lined with wrinkles that spoke of stress beyond human tolerance. He maintained his faith, but it had transformed into something harder and more desperate. The faith of a man who has seen the face of unreality and chosen to believe in order anyway. As for myself, I eventually recovered enough function to be called conscious, though I was never entirely whole again. My third eye, exposed to raw warp without protection, had been permanently altered. I could no longer navigate in the traditional sense. The warp was too loud, too present, pressing against my consciousness at all times. I saw things that were not there, or perhaps saw things that were there but should not have been visible. The tech priests fitted me with psychic dampeners and prescribed medications that dulled my perception, but nothing could entirely silence the whispers. I was relieved of my duties as navigator, adept, though with honor. The Imperium recognized my sacrifice, awarding me commendations and pensions that meant nothing to a man who could barely remember his own name most days. I was assigned to light duty, cataloging warp charts and teaching novice navigators the basics of psychic shielding. It was meaningless work, but it kept me anchored to something resembling purpose. The Cathedral of Iron continued, in service for another 50 years after our emergence. She was rebuilt, purified, reconsecrated, her tainted sections excised and replaced. But those who served aboard her in later years reported strange experiences. Voices in the corridors that spoke in dead languages, shadows that moved against the light, rooms that appeared only to certain people at certain times. The ship remembered what had happened to her in the warp, and memory has weight. In the Imperium, eventually, the cathedral was retired from active service and declared a reliquary vessel, her hull blessed, and her interior converted into a shrine to those who had died during the voyage. She orbits a shrine world now, a monument to sacrifice and faith, and the price of being lost. I think about that voyage every day in the moments when my medications were thin and the warp presses close against my perception. I think about the crew who died in ways that made no sense, their death stretched across subjective eternities, or compressed into instants. I think about the phantom cathedral born from our fear and destroyed by my sacrifice. I think about Captain Helix and his absolute faith, which kept the crew functioning even when reality itself was falling apart. But mostly I think about what it means to be lost. Not lost in a simple way, but lost in the sense that all references cease to exist. All maps become useless. All directions lead nowhere. To be lost in the warp is to be lost from meaning itself. To exist in a space where existence is negotiable and identity is temporary. We escaped, but we brought something back with us. All of us who survived carry the warp inside us now, a shadow of unreality that never quite leaves. We see things differently than other people. We perceive patterns that should not exist. We remember events that never happened alongside the events that did. Our memories as fractured and unstable as the ship's geometry became during our voyage. The Imperium calls us survivors, but survival is a strange word for what we experienced. We did not survive the warp. We passed through it, and it passed through us. And what emerged on the other side was something that wore our names and faces, but was not entirely what had entered. We are changed things transformed by exposure to unreality, and we will never be whole again. I am recording this account because I believe it is important that someone understand what happened. The official records are sanitized, reduced to tactical data and casualty reports. They do not capture the true horror of being adrift in a realm where time and space are provisional and identity is negotiable. They do not explain what it means to watch your ship become a reflection of your darkest fears, or to sacrifice your mind to save your comrades from an enemy that was born from their own consciousness. The warp is not hell. Hell has rules, boundaries, a cosmic justice, even if it is terrible. The warp is beyond such concepts. It is the place where meaning goes to die, where all stories become possible, and therefore none are true. To be lost, there is to be lost from the narrative of reality itself, cast into a space where you can be anything and therefore are nothing. I survived, but I am not grateful for survival. I am simply here, existing in the ruins of what I was recording these words, because the act of forming coherent thought is the only thing that reminds me I once had a self to lose. And sometimes in the depths of night, when my medications fail and my third eye opens unbidden, I see the Cathedral of Iron as she was in the warp. Not the physical vessel, but the idea of the vessel, the concept given, formed by our collective will to survive. I see her sailing through impossible geometries, her hull singing prayers in languages that predate human speech, her corridors endless, and her cargo the souls of the lost. I see her, and I wonder if we truly escaped at all, or if we are still there, still adrift, still dying across infinite timelines, while some fragment of us exists here in real space, dreaming of salvation that will never come. The warp does not release its prey easily, and those who enter its depths are marked forever by the experience. We carry it with us, a stain on our souls that no amount of faith or penance can erase. We are survivors of being lost, and that survival is its own form of damnation. This is what happens when an Imperial ship gets lost in the warp. This is the price of divergence. This is the cost of being nowhere, when nowhere is everywhere, and everywhere is nothing at all. I am Navigator Adept, Real Voss, and I have told you the truth of the Cathedral of Iron. Remember it when you next enter the warp. Remember it when the currents shift and the way forward becomes uncertain. Remember that being lost is not a simple thing, and that some ships that emerge from the Imperium do so only in body, their souls left behind in the screaming void. Remember and pray you never experience